Well, hi, I'm Billy Beck, Extension Forestry Specialist with Iowa State University Extension Outreach, and I'm also with the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management at Iowa State. Thanks so much for watching CropsTV. I am really pumped to be here today to talk about windbreaks, the establishment, the management, the renovation, and now that we've had 2 derechos in 2 years, I've thrown in a little bit about recovery. This here is a nice looking windbreak right down the road here in Story County. As I drive around the state though, I see so many windbreaks in need of renovation. They're getting old, they have a lifespan, they're losing their functionality. And I also see a lot of spots where windbreaks just don't exist, where they can be doing a great deal of benefit, but they simply are not present on the landscape. And even this beautiful windbreak here in Story County, if you get close up to it, it is getting older and it is losing some of its function due to its age progression. And we'll get into some of those details there. But if you know me, you know that I really like to promote trees as an asset to the agricultural enterprise. So windbreaks are a great way to enhance your agricultural operation using trees. So real quick plan for today, we only got a limited time here and there's a lot of details on windbreaks that cannot be covered in this time. However, at the end of this, I'm going to connect you with the folks, the technical service, and the educational resources that are really going to help you with your windbreak project, renovation, establishment, and management, and make that a successful project. So today, I'm going to cover some just really big concepts to start thinking about when you're thinking about establishing these, you're thinking about managing them, and then again, renovation and recovery. So I want to start off with, again, how windbreaks add value to the farm enterprise here in Iowa. There's a number of great ways they do that, and I'm going to go over them very quickly. Next, I kind of want to get into how windbreaks work. They seem very ultra simple, but there's a lot going on there with airflow and air movement. It's really interesting stuff. So just kind of a crash course on how windbreaks actually get the job done. And then I want to cover some big concepts on establishing and managing windbreaks. You can't just plant them and walk away, they need management. And then some big concepts on renovation and recovery. And again, these things have a lifespan. They definitely need to be renovated at some point. And as I go around the state, a lot of our windbreaks are in desperate need of renovation to restore that functionality. And then finally, like I said, who are the people, the technical service, and the educational resources that can get this job done successfully on your farm. So like I said before, I love promoting trees to the agricultural community. This is just a cool example out of Polk County. I was actually out there on Monday. It was about 1 degree Fahrenheit. But this was a really neat example of a wide range of tree practices on this operation that really were used to enhance not only the economic return, but also to meet their goals for the land. So water quality goals, wildlife goals, clean air goals. Very, very cool place down here. And again, windbreaks were a big component of this operation's tree resource. So I'm going to say it again a million times here today, but trees really do enhance the agricultural operation. So as you cruise around Iowa, most of the windbreaks you see are around our farmsteads. So protecting our outbuildings, protecting our homes. If you look around the literature, we see an average of about 10 to 20% annual energy savings by having a windbreak around our property. Great for snow control. It allows you to control where snow is deposited, so it's not on your driveway, it's not right up against your house. Privacy, blocking your neighbors. Increases in property value, just general beauty and aesthetics. They're really, really nice to have on a parcel of land. And of course, you get that wildlife component, drawing them in where you can see from your living room and your kitchen, you can see all the great wildlife that they would bring in. When we get a little bit further out away from the house, this is also fairly common, but not too much. Associated with livestock and grazing. And this is actually that parcel I showed before from the air. This is in Polk County. But these have incredible value for grazing operations as far as summer and winter protection. Summer being shade, winter being the winds and snow. Producers have told me time and time and again, you can see this in the literature, reduced mortality and increased gains, especially in the winter. Snow management, again, specifically or strategically placing these windbreaks and designing them so that snow is dropped away from feedlots to reduce costs associated with removing that snow. And I've had one producer say they act as living barns, which I love. I love that saying. So that's not mine. I put that in quotes there. But just again, looking around the literature, one study, 0.11 kilogram per day in increased winter cattle weight gains, windbreak protected versus non-windbreak protected. And if you do the math there, that gets to be a number of kilograms if you kind of expand it out to hundreds of head there. So this again was the example from Polk County. That photo on the top was taken. It was about 1 degree. That was the New Year's Eve event where it got very, very bitterly cold. And the bottom photo there, he's now moving those cattle out to a less protected paddock now that the temperatures were rising up into the single digits and teens. But as the temperatures dropped again that week, he moved them into that denser windbreak for protection in the winter. So very, very valuable to livestock and grazing. Animal confinement, I see these a lot when I'm riding my motorcycle up around Fort Dodge and the Des Moines Lobe. These are also called vegetative environmental buffers. You see that a lot, the VEBs. These offer great summer and winter protection, lower energy costs. Big one for these, I think, is the odor and dust control, as well as the public relations, the PR. One study out of Iowa, 40 to 60% reduction in odorous gas emissions on a swine facility just downwind from that VEB. So I'm not going to touch on these a lot today. I'm going to focus mostly on the windbreaks associated with farmsteads and the livestock operations, but just want to throw this out there. It is a valuable practice, again, adding trees to the farm enterprise. These are some cool numbers from a review on windbreaks in the literature. We don't see a lot of field windbreaks or shelter belts at all in Iowa. There's a couple on I-35 as you head towards Minneapolis. I saw these a lot out in western Kansas and in the Dakotas when I was working on the Great Plains. But there's yield increases associated with this. They protect from desiccating summer winds. A lot of them, especially those that have hardwood components, allow snow to filter through the windbreak, but with a reduced velocity so it drops and is captured on the field. And if you get 14 inches of rain a year, every inch counts, so that's very valuable. But I just kind of highlighted the maize and soybeans mean yield increases that were noted from this literature review there, 12 and 16. So these do have value for crop production. But these are not very common in Iowa. Doesn't mean they're not important, but I'm not going to really touch on these a lot today either. And I love this, the stacked enterprise nature of these. This is, again, that Polk County example, but not only can the farm enterprise use these to block wind and protect crops and livestock, they can also be used to diversify farm income and produce a lot of ecosystem goods and services. So this example here from Polk County, looking at stacked enterprises, those are some black walnuts and other oaks planted for timber and fuelwood harvest in the future, as well as fence posts. And then a lot of shrubs were incorporated for non-timber forest products, so nuts and decorative floral material that you could harvest from those areas. So they don't only just block wind, they are a source of diversified income for the farm. That said, they are underutilized and challenges do exist with programmatic challenges and harvesting operations for timber harvest and windbreaks. It is a challenge, but it definitely is doable. And of course, ecosystem goods and services, you have those compound benefits of incredible wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, clean water. The photo up at the top right there was kind of all three. That was a protective barrier for the livestock feeding area. It was next to a perennial creek, so you get the water quality impact, and then of course the wildlife impact from adding that very diverse oak and hardwood assemblage there on the landscape. So a lot of cool stuff that these things can double up on the farm. All right, so I want to get into a little bit on how windbreaks work, and this has a lot of implications on what we're doing when we're thinking about design, species selection, position on the landscape, and thinking about what we want to protect. I have a forestry background, but I also have a hydrology background, and I love studying how water flows. Wind flows very similar to water, so this part is fascinating to me about how windbreaks work. There's a lot more going on here than folks think. So a windbreak essentially is designed to reduce wind velocities and protect an area for a variety of reasons. So what it does primarily is it ramps that air up, deflects it up and over the windbreak, kind of as a ramp and a deflector there. But one important piece, that green line down there, some wind inevitably does get through the windbreak, and that plays a very important role. That's driven by density of the foliage. That plays an important role that we're going to talk about here in a second. So what that does is on the leeward side of the windbreak, that creates what's called a zone of protection, or I just called it a ZP for today. But that ZP, that zone of protection, is influenced by a lot of different things. So many things that go into the design component impact the size and the shape and the extent of this zone of protection. So again, very important to think about these things. The top thing, no pun intended, I guess, but the top thing is height. So the height of the windbreak, the mature height of the trees established in that windbreak, is going to be the defining factor of the zone of protection, how large of an area the windbreak protects. But density also plays a very important role. Density just being that ratio of the solid part of the windbreak to the gaps between the trees and the leaves and all that stuff. So we'll call height for the rest of today H, and density will be denoted as D. Some other things that make a big difference are the length of the windbreak and also the orientation related to the prevailing wind. So be thinking about this stuff as you're looking to design a windbreak for your operation. So the height is the main driver of the zone of protection. And in general, the zone of protection extends about 30 times the height of the mature windbreak on the leeward side of that windbreak. One cool thing that folks don't realize is there's also a zone on the windward side. So it protects about 2 to 5 times the height on the windward side as well. Density, though, really has an important role in determining the zone of protection size. We'll get into that here in a second. So if you think about it, you would really want a very dense windbreak, right? You wouldn't want any wind coming through that thing to protect your resource. However, if we did put, like, say, a brick wall up there and we had 0% wind penetration, would that really make a difference? And the answer is yes. So let's do it. Let's just build a wall here. It's 100% dense. There's no wind getting through there. So what would happen to the zone of protection? It's very interesting. So what does happen, it's almost like an airplane wing. That wind goes up and over. All of the wind is now going up and over this thing. There's nothing going through. And what happens is it creates a zone of low pressure right on the leeward side of that windbreak. And that causes a lot of turbulence as air from above is pulled down and starts to swirl around there. So that really drastically reduces the zone of protection. And what you see is you get a really, really big reduction in wind velocity right behind the windbreak. But as you go out a little bit, you see a very fast increase in wind speeds. So now with this 100% density, we have a zone of protection that has shrunk to about 15 times the height of that wall. So when you're designing these things, it's really important to think about your species, about mature height and the density, or like the canopy closure, the foliage density, and kind of tweak those to get a sweet spot to match that zone that you're looking to protect. So height and density together play a big role. All right, so here's some numbers from Brandl and Finch 1991 that kind of hit this home. We've got our conifer windbreak, so 40 to 60% density. And again, density is the ratio of solid material to gaps in the canopy. And then we've got our wall example, so 100% density. So again, thinking about foliage species creating a more dense or less dense windbreak to get what you need. And if we look, we've got 5 times the height, 10 times the height, 15, 20, and 30 times the height out. And we have miles per hour of wind and the percentage of that open wind speed. So let's just consider an open wind speed for this example at 20 miles an hour. So typical Iowa day, you know, it's calm, it's 20-mile-an-hour winds. So for the conifer with less density, you see a lower amount of wind reduction right on the leeward side of that windbreak. But that wind reduction effect goes on all the way out to that 30 height limit, the 30H limit. So it takes almost 30 heights of that windbreak to get back to about 95% of the open wind speed. And for the wall, you get a dramatic decrease in wind speeds right off the bat. However, at 15 times the height, you're already back to that open wind speed of 20 miles an hour. So just some things to think about when you're playing around with height and density. Do you want an immediate wind drop, a very significant wind drop right off the bat, and you could care less about the wind velocities further out? Or do you want to protect a much larger area? If you want to protect a much larger area in general, drop the density back. If you want a rapid decrease, get the density up. So length matters as well. This is kind of a plan view looking down from an airplane, let's say. Optimally, you would want a length at least 10 times the height of that mature vegetation, because as we know, wind goes around the windbreak, not just up and over it. So 10 times and above, you're going to get that larger zone of protection in the back. If you shrink that, you're going to get a much narrower and smaller zone of protection. And for all these things, I get it. It's very challenging. We all have limited space. There's a lot going on. Each site is very, very unique and different. That's why I'm going to hit on this a lot in this talk. Always work with the pros when designing these things. They're going to take into account what you're trying to protect, your space, your resources, the soils, the vegetation, the trees, the shrubs that would work to get you what the optimal protection that you're looking for. But length also definitely plays a role here. Lastly is orientation to the prevailing winds. And I guess you think about this, I had to think a little bit. Most folks know where the prevailing winds are coming from in their area. Around here in Ames in the winter, it's from the north and the northwest. And in the summer, you get those hot winds from the south. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, you need optimally to orient that windbreak to a 90-degree angle perpendicular to those prevailing winds. So that's going to give you the largest zone of protection by doing that at that 90-degree angle. When you move it, it's kind of like moving like an airplane wing or something. That zone of protection on the leeward side is going to shrink. So orientation, optimal, 90 degrees. So when you're designing, those are just some things to think about. This is just I just randomly pulled this aerial photo. If this is your house, congratulations, I guess I'll buy you a beverage. But this is just a random house. You see this a lot of open space. They've got some cattle in the back. They've got a shop. Start thinking about what your goals are as far as protection. Are you looking to enhance anything, like that snow capture we talked about in the western plains there? Think about what you're working with, distances, space, proximity. And then finally get into some species selection, looking at how to tweak that height and density sweet spot so you can get the maximum zone of protection there. All right, so for windbreaks, I just want to cover some big stuff. There's no way to fit in all the details, and every site is different. Every operation is different, soils are different, the resources that you have available to you are different. So these are just some really big concepts to think about when you're talking with your professional and designing or renovating or managing these windbreaks. So off the bat, always, I really suggest to work with the pros. Myself and my colleagues at the Iowa State University Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic, when we see and we get the calls about windbreak disease and insect issues, low vigor windbreaks, loss of functionality in windbreaks, it's almost always kind of these DIY, do-it-yourself windbreaks. I kind of like this tree. I put it in there. I spaced them this way. I spaced them way too close because I wanted them to have an immediate effect. So really work with the pros. It's going to ensure that these projects are successful over time. These are a long-term investment. And how you do it off the start is going to really up your chances for success in the future. So for windbreaks, it's a little bit different than your traditional forestry practices in this state. NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, should be your first stop as far as consulting on windbreaks. So what they will do is they'll come out, they'll bring probably a soil map and a bunch of other resources with them. They've already seen your property, and they'll work with you to match the species to the site and match the design to achieve your goals. Also, too, I want to point out at this link here, you can pause it because it's we're recording here, but pause that, check that link out. Those can hook you up with forestry contractors that could assist you with things like planting, weed control, herbicide applications to really make the projects a success too. So NRCS, first stop, and there is a link, check it out, to our forestry contractor list. There's a variety of ways to do this via cost share to get some funding to assist. One of the most common ones in this state is REAP, the Resource Enhancement and Protection Program. Very, very flexible. Again, NRCS, your county USDA service center, is the first stop there. There's also options. They're not terribly common, but there's still options. EQIP and CRP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and the Conservation Reserve Program also have windbreak options. Something to think about too with timing. Most plantings are in the spring because you plant conifers in the spring. You can plant hardwoods in the spring or the fall. Conifers, it's recommended to plant in the spring. So if you're thinking about REAP, start getting to think about your windbreak and anytime in August through February for planting. EQIP might take a little bit longer, so you should probably start thinking about that at least a year in advance. So that's kind of the seasonal schedule, thinking about getting on board with windbreaks. All right, moving on with other establishment big concepts. One of the almost most important decision you can make is your species selection, and that's going to depend on a variety of things, from what site you got, what soils you got, what resources you're looking to protect, and what kind of compound benefits you might want. Do you want to have non-timber forest products? Do you want to have wildlife habitat? But species are very, very important, and again, your NRCS professional will come to you with a list of species that are appropriate for the soils on your site, so you don't have to fret too much there. But Iowa is challenging. We only have a handful of native conifers that have that dense evergreen foliage for that winter protection. So it's challenging in this state. We only really do have a number of proven conifer species that work well in windbreaks. Native ones that work great. I know it's a species that folks love to hate, but I'm going to get you to fall in love with red cedar. But eastern red cedar, an incredibly valuable windbreak species. Eastern white pine, also very, very good native species for windbreaks. Northern white cedar, it's not native to Iowa, but it is native to the U.S. One thing with that is it does have some deer issues. Deer love to browse on it. Norway spruce is not native to the U.S., but it's very hardy in Iowa winters. And then white fir, also non-native to Iowa, native to the U.S., and it's fairly hardy in windbreaks. So in Iowa, conifer species are limited, but there's some great options that are out there listed right there on your screen. And again, think about the height and density because you're going to tweak those to get that optimal zone of protection. Adding hardwoods. This is something I really, really encourage. You don't see it a lot, but hardwoods are a great component for windbreaks for a wide range of reasons. This is that same producer from Polk County. He added a black walnut component to his windbreak for future timber harvest and also nut production as a source of diversified farm income. But what hardwood species do to your windbreak is they really add diversity, obviously in species, but diversity in structure as well. So structure is like the physical layout of the windbreak, which leads to a resilient windbreak. You want a lot of different species and you want diverse structure. That leads to resilience. You're going to bounce back from storm events. You're going to bounce back from disease and insect issues. You're going to have a much longer lived windbreak that is fully functional if you have that diversity of species in there. And the wildlife component too is one of his big drivers for including walnuts and other oaks, actually in this photo in the back, in that windbreak planting. And then of course diversified income, timber, fence posts, things like that, fuel wood. They add a unique function too, and again, this is not for everybody, and you need to design your windbreak based on what you're trying to do, but like I was talking about the Western Plains, hardwood components allow that snow to pass through and become deposited on fields, adding a boost of moisture to your annual precipitation. And again, you can kind of use these to tweak that overall windbreak density to height ratio to get exactly what you're looking for. So we have a lot more options for hardwood windbreaks in Iowa than conifers. We have a lot more native hardwoods in Iowa than conifers. But black walnuts, oaks, hackberry, and many more. Those three right there that I listed are very common in the windbreaks that I do see that have hardwood components. But there is a lot available. But always, always, always match the species to the site. And that's where NRCS and the professional folks there can help you make that decision. Shrubs. I love it when folks add shrubs to windbreaks. There's a wide variety of reasons they do it. One of them is that it's kind of acting as the windward ramp, kind of giving that wind an extra boost to get up and over that windbreak. And that's another thing to think about is like those conifer species we listed. Cedar is kind of a medium range height tree. Shrubs are a low height tree. White pine a very tall tree. So placing them in that order makes a nice ramp to deflect that wind. Probably the most common reason that folks plant shrubs in the windbreak is the wildlife component. That's probably the number one thing that I hear, that folks incorporate shrubs into the plantings. And we have an incredible assemblage of native shrubs in Iowa that are going to do great for wildlife. I can think of a lot. Gray dogwood is one of my favorite shrubs in general, but it was an excellent windbreak planting option there. Second is diversified income. We talked about stacked enterprises, income from berries, aronia berries, nuts, hazelnuts, decorative floral material can be harvested from these shrub rows in your windbreak. The one thing I will say with getting all these great wildlife-friendly things out with the birds is kind of watch out for invasive encroachment. I've seen that a lot. Birds come in, they deposit seeds from elsewhere, so you really have to stay on top of that. Not even just the shrub rows, but the whole windbreak in general. Monitor, assess for that invasive species presence. Things like honeysuckle, buckthorn, oriental bittersweet, all can be detrimental to the windbreak planting. But overall, shrubs, incredible addition to a windbreak. So, management. This is often overlooked not only in windbreaks, but in forests in general and tree plantings in general across the state. Windbreaks are a little bit different than forests in that they really don't self-regenerate. So we kind of have to tend them, we kind of have to take care of them to ensure their functionality is at its peak throughout their lifetime. So you can't just plant these things and walk away. Maintain them early and maintain them often. You're going to want to do a lot more maintenance right off the bat to get those species up and get a competitive edge over any kind of competing vegetation that would be there. And that's going to have a long-term impact. So these are a long-term practice. If you do a lot of effort up front, you're going to have big results in the end there. So what leads to failed windbreaks? And this can be, what leads to mismanaged forests and forests that aren't achieving their maximum potential. I would say low vigor. You see a lot of low vigor windbreaks out there. And what does that come from? And these things could each individually be a presentation. So your NRCS folks, your professional forester, your forestry contractors can help you make the decisions on these. But in general, these are some very basic things you can do to improve the vigor of your windbreak species. And that's going to be a fully functional windbreak for the lifespan of that practice. So when I see low vigor windbreaks, it's usually from a number of things, a combination of things, which may include improper irrigation right off the bat, right? So think about that. Do you have a water source? If you're dropping $1,000 on trees, do you have a water source in the case of a year of 2021, the summer of 2021? Weed control, critical. 3 years of weed control at minimum. And those forestry contractors can help you out with that until that canopy closes and we see the shade block out competing vegetation. Improper pruning, improper thinning, improper site prep. We want to prep the site, prep the soil so those roots can really get in there and establish nicely. Another thing too is deer damage. There's a lot of options out there for deer damage, everything from fencing to deterrence, chemical deterrence. Cattle damage, that rotational grazing operation we showed had hot wire around all their windbreaks when they were small, so that cattle would stay out of there when they wouldn't damage the seedlings. So improve vigor. If you do anything to work to improve the vigor of these plantings, then are going to pay off long term. So as far as management, there's a lot of diseases out there that impact windbreaks, primarily because we don't have a lot of conifers in the state and we plant a lot of non-native stuff that is susceptible to insects and disease. But I got two things here that I think I see almost everywhere. And these kind of result from A, using a species that's not native to Iowa, and B, planting 1 to 2 species. So incredibly low diversity in these plantings. So this, I'm sure you all have seen this. This is spruce needle cast fungus. So on non-native spruce, this is probably a Colorado spruce. Beautiful tree. It's just not native to Iowa and it does not thrive here at all. So it's prone to insect and disease issues. So this is spruce needlecast fungus. I see this almost everywhere I go that has a low diversity in it. And the interesting thing about this needlecast fungus is it starts from the bottom and works its way up, and it starts from the inside of the tree canopy and works its way out. So just to think about that, it's a fungus, it loves water. So think about a windbreak and where would be the most humid, wind-protected environment. It'd be lower in the canopy and in the center part of the canopy near the main stem. So that's kind of where this thing emanates. And there's a lot of management techniques you can do to address this, not only in your planning with using more diversity and different species, but some corrective pruning and things as well. And we've got resources for that online. But this is almost by far one of the most common things I see and most common things we get calls on is this needlecast fungus. So use natives and increase your diversity in your plantings. This is a second one, but it's harmless. We get a lot of calls and questions on this, and this pops up a lot in the fall and winter. This is seasonal needle loss. This is a white pine seasonal needle loss. This is essentially just conifers' way of shedding their leaves, just like deciduous trees do, except that they don't lose them all at once in the fall. So one thing to notice about this versus like a serious factor like needlecast is notice the position of the dead needles on the stem. So the current year's growth is nice and green. The previous year's growth is getting ready to drop. It's getting ready to get rid of those leaves on this white pine here. So that's one big thing to look for is where are those leaves, those needles, yellowing? Is it in the current year's growth or last year's growth? If it's last year's growth and the tree looks vigorous and healthy in general, you probably got just general old seasonal needle loss. Conifer's way of refreshing its leaves. So I said this before, and as I drive around the state, most of our windbreaks, it looks like, are in need of renovation. These things have a lifespan. We need to reset the clock so they maintain their functionality. So what are some things to look for to see, is it time to renovate? Well, first off, you should be assessing early and often. So on a yearly basis, be out there looking what's going on, what's dying, are there invasive species, what's the canopy doing, are the disease issues going on out there, are the trees growing together and how much? This photo on the right, that windbreak in Story County, we see a lot of white mulberry coming up, and that's going to block out sun to the Norway spruce and the eastern red cedar in the summertime. So just things like that to assess and address early and often. So in spring and summer and winter, some things that you can look for to see is my windbreak functionality being compromised or lost. Summer, check out dead limbs, dead trees. What's the density of the windbreak? Has it changed over time? I'm a photo person. I take photo points of stuff on my place, and as far as my field research every year, take a photo every year. See if that density, the gaps in the canopy are changing. Look for invasive species and look for vines that are coming up in the understory there that could block out sunlight in the future for the desired species. Winter is a really cool time to see if your windbreak is functioning. If you don't believe me, stand on the windward and the leeward side and see if there's a big difference there. But one thing that's neat to look at in the winter is the snow deposition patterns. So if you have this giant splay of snow deposition coming off certain parts of your windbreak, that might be an indicator that there's gaps there and something's going on, where there's dieback or we need some renovation activities in there. So assess early and assess often. Renovation is tough because, like I've said all presentation, there's so many variables, so many differences in landowners and sites and soils and objectives that there's no real cookbook recipe as far as renovation. Again, these are the times where the professionals at NRCS, your Iowa DNR district forester, your private forestry consultant can really help you in the planning of a successful renovation effort. There's a whole lot of practices that this may include, which are cost shareable many times. You may thin in between the rows to add growing space to existing more dominant trees. Removal of dead material, mulching, a practice called coppicing, which is actually applied to hardwoods where you can slice off a young tree and allow it to re-sprout with a better form. Site prep. You may need to add rows or add trees, adding weed barrier fabric, tree planting by hand and machine, and sometimes a complete removal is necessary to really reset the system and get a functional windbreak for the future. So no cookbook recipe exists. Work with the pros, but I think a lot of our windbreaks are in need of renovation, and these are some of the techniques that you can use to achieve that. Here's a really quick case study. This is the Story County windbreak that I've been talking about all presentation, but this is a farmstead windbreak, so protecting shops, driveways, few outbuildings, and the actual home itself. This was established about 30 years ago. It's beautiful from afar, and it's doing its job, doing a really good job, but this is a practice that ages. It's getting to the point where it does need some renovation work. This was established with starting windward to leeward, a row of lilac and red osier dogwood as shrubs, eastern red cedar, medium height tree, Norway spruce, and then finally with eastern white pine, because the landowner liked eastern white pine. Who doesn't, right? But they wanted that on the side closest to their house. So they spaced the rows 18 feet apart, and the in-row spacing of trees was also 18 feet apart. And again, think about that density that you want and what you're trying to achieve. But check this out, and again, this is a really cool photo point you could take every year. I'm looking perpendicular to this linear planting, and there's definitely some gaps. And again, we do want wind coming through there because of that low pressure concept, but standing on this on that 1 degree day, you could feel the wind coming through there. So in the center of this, the canopies are going to naturally self-prune. That's just what they do when those needles are in a low light situation. But what happened here, what really opened those gaps up, if you look at the top right, there was a row of shrubs. That red osier dogwood, that lilac shrub row is now gone. It was very overgrown with vines and some other unwanted species, so the landowner decided to take a mower in there and chop them all up, mulch them all up, and they're going to get ready to replant that shrub row in the spring. So they're going to prep the site, and they're going to machine plant a row of shrubs to kind of refill in those gaps. The top of the trees are looking great. The center of the windbreak is getting some self-pruning. That's just what it does naturally. But that loss of that shrub row is really kind of what opened up those gaps there. So again, a unique situation and unique tactics to address that situation there. All right, so we're 2 for 2 for derechos in 20 and 21. So I want to just talk real quick on recovery, resources, and strategies. And a lot of the concepts I talked about now are very applicable to this. Things like there's no cookbook recipe, work with the professionals, diversity, vigor are your friend. So here we're going to do really 3 scenarios that I've commonly seen around the state following the derecho. Number 1, I haven't looked too much at derecho number 2, but storm damage happens every year in Iowa, localized from storms. So 3 quick scenarios, and then the recovery resources that can help you kind of get these back fully functional. So the number 1 scenario is just spotty or isolated damage. This would be more like less derecho stuff, more typical winter storm wind damage. So one thing here to keep in mind is that most windbreak species in Iowa are shade intolerant, which means they don't grow well in the shade. So patching, putting young trees in these small patches is gonna be tough. So general cleanup may be your best strategy, and just hope those neighboring trees can close the gap and fill in and restore functionality there. But the biggest thing, takeaway from this slide, is that most species are shade intolerant, and they're just not going to do well if you put a young seedling in there and try to patch it up. Larger gaps. So this is almost a large loss of functionality. In fact, the wind going through there would actually be increased if you think about that pinch point there. So you got to think, you got to assess, will the neighbors fill the gaps? And in this case with these white pines, just from me looking at it, my answer would be no. So what do? You can't put really smaller trees in there because they're going to eventually be shaded out as those larger trees expand. So what do? So it's kind of a tricky situation. And again, it's site-specific, and your professional is going to help you work through this. One situation may be, or one option, is to add more rows if room allows. So just add on some smaller seedling rows, looking forward to the future, And you can keep those mature trees for the diverse structure, the wildlife benefits, and the existing windbreak benefits, and then remove them when your smaller trees get to that point where they're starting to be functional. But takeaway from this slide is kind of look around and see, will the neighbors fill those gaps, and how much space do I have to either add rows or address that way? So a lot of times you need to completely start over from scratch, and a lot of the establishment concepts I talked about earlier are going to be really relevant here. But functionality is gone here. If you got these windbreaks that are completely destroyed and broke and snapped. So with this, I would really work with NRCS, but also consult your professional forester about species considerations. Do they match the site soils? Are they going to meet your objectives? But just like I talked about before, NRCS is going to be your first stop. They're going to come help you with the design and get you enrolled in cost share programs if that's where you want to go. So same things I've been saying: diversity, 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 match the species of the site, and consider wildlife if you're starting over. If you've got a low diversity windbreak that was busted up, consider adding diversity and consider adding some wildlife plantings to the mix. Wildlife design is very interesting, and we've got a great pub from our wildlife extension specialist online. Check that out. One thing I say about the wildlife plantings, you can get a little sloppy, and that's a good thing. Wildlife love a little kind of rough around the edges look to your windbreak, and that's definitely a good thing. But check out that pub and consider wildlife when you're looking to rebuild. Shrubs. Diversity of native shrubs exists. If you haven't had them before, a lot of the derecho impacted windbreaks I saw were single species, 1 to 2, 3 rows, not very wide, no shrubs. So when you're building back, think about adding those shrubs for the edge of the ramp, the wildlife, and the non-timber forest products. And then boom, there's your hardy conifer species for Iowa. And then we've got a ton of native species for hardwoods that would work well in your windbreaks. I'll say it again: blue, white, Black Hill spruce, really cool trees, not native to Iowa and very prone to needle cast. They just don't like this Iowa climate that goes from hot, humid summers to very bitterly cold, dry winters. So stick with the top crew there if you're looking for conifers. So there's a lot on here, but we're taped, so you can pause it. But here's some great windbreak resources to ensure success. Check out the Iowa State University Extension Forestry website. Just search windbreaks. We've got a lot of educational resources there. I'll do a shameless plug on February 8th. If you're watching this, we're doing a windbreak school in Tama County. It's open statewide. It's free. You can find that on the website as well. Technical service, like I've been saying all presentation, NRCS is your first stop for windbreaks. It's a little bit different than other forestry things in the state where you would go to your professional forester first. But down the road, as you're looking to manage and think about renovation, talk to your DNR district forester, talk to your private forestry consultant about their thoughts on what would be the best path forward. And we've got a great link on our website. You go to that link, it shows the state of Iowa. You click on your county, and you can find the district foresters and the consulting foresters that serve your county on that webpage. So very, very cool there. Again, cost share options exist: REAP, EQIP, CRP. And if you're looking for growing stock, now again, this is smaller conservation bare root seedling stock, but Iowa DNR State Forest Nursery, if you're thinking about conifers for the spring, they open up sales online in early fall. So thinking about that. So Iowa DNR State Forest Nursery, a great, great place. Not the only place, but a good place to get growing stock for windbreaks. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this tree edition of CropsTV. Again, I'm Billy Beck, and feel free to use me as a resource too. Hit me up on social media, email, website, and I encourage you to stay on the leeward side. I experienced this near frostbite situation on January 6th out at a great windbreak. I'm on the windward side here, about -10 wind chill, but get those windbreaks back fully functional on the landscape. They're an asset to agriculture, and stay on the leeward side. Thanks.